Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm very, very glad to see and hopefully to hear all of you today. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the show's creator, chief caterer, host, and MC. I'll be your guide for the next 59 minutes or so as we explore what's happening with net neutrality and what that means for the future of education and technology. Before we dive in, let me just give you some introductory thoughts, some background of the forum and where it comes from. So, Tara, the next slide, please. So the forum is a video conference discussion-based spin-off from my monthly trends analysis. So if you haven't seen it, the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report, or FTTE, it's a monthly publication that tracks about 83 or 86 trends reshaping education technology as we know it. We've been doing this for some years, so we have some good longitudinal data, and this helps us think about where education might be headed in the near, medium, and the long-term future. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, go to ftte.us, download some sample copies, and subscribe. Now, over to the next slide, please. This is part of a larger enterprise called the Future of Education Observatory, where we try to look at where education could be headed. That includes a wide variety of media, including this forum, including FTTE report, including an online book club, as well as a blog, and a few other resources just about to come out. So if you haven't gone there yet, go to futureofeducation.us and learn more. Over the next slide, please. Now, if we're going to be having this kind of conversation, we really need to be thinking about it in terms of the globe. So one can talk about education technology in terms of one's region or nation, but it's really important to think about it internationally because so many developments are happening that really cross borders. And thanks in part to the internet, we have such a global marketplace of education that we really have to be thinking about those terms. And so far, the forum has had participation from every continent. We've had a wide range of conversations from a wide range of nations. So as we proceed, and today we're thinking of one particular change to American policy, please keep in mind the global context. Now, we can only do this kind of conversation with the help of some very generous people, and I want to thank them before we proceed. The first, I want to thank NYSERNet from New York State. This is a nonprofit that helps connect that state's universities, colleges, as well as museums, hospitals, and libraries to the internet. We're very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig, because as you can see here, Shindig makes this technology available. And let me just take a minute to walk through the technology in case you're new to it or need a refresher. First of all, where I am right now and where these slides are for the next minute or so is called the stage. And it's called such because everyone here gets to see and hear what's on stage. And hopefully you can join us up here in a little while. I'll explain that in a second. Below us is all of you, what we think of as the audience swarm. If you look around, you can see individual icons for either individual people or sign-ins or groups. So if you mouse over, you can see Ben Harwood, who is now hidden by his whiteboard, or you can see Keisa Johnson about to smile at us from Michigan. And you can see a wide range of people here. If you want to talk to somebody, you can simply double-click on them. And if they want to talk to you, your two icons will snap together like Legos. You'll have your own private audio-visual bubble. And that's one way to communicate. But there are other ways as well. Look to the very bottom of the screen. There's a white strip running along with a bunch of icons. If you look all the way to the left edge, the first thing you'll see is a number. Right now it's 45 and some people. That number shows how many people are in this particular video conference. If you click on that, up will pop a kind of slideshow of everybody who's in here. So if you want to look for people that you know or just get a sense of who's here, just run through that. Now, when people come in, they get sorted into individual rooms. Each room is about 18 or so, so I think we've got 3 rooms right now. If you want to pop between rooms, just go to the very right edge of the screen, the very bottom. You'll see a little white chevron. If you click that, it'll pop you over to the next room and you can join conversations there. Why does that matter? Well, first of all, it's people who are near you in this space. But also, down that white strip, the next icon over is the icon for a chat box. It says text chat. If you pop it up, you'll get a chat room with the nearest 17 or 18 people coming with you. So right now, I can chat with Brenda, Anissa, Jarret, Tara, Mary, Eileen, Taylor, Christy, Ruth, Vicky, Keisa, Roger, Jennifer, and a few others. So that's one way to communicate. Just type in the chat box and get a conversation with people who are all around you. If you haven't done so yet, just introduce yourself by typing in who you are, where you are. So the chat box works. Bottom there, the white strip, there are 2 other options that are even more powerful. Next to the chat box icon is a question mark, a circle around it. If you click that, you'll be able to type in a question or a comment that you'd like to ask us. And we'll save that. And the moment is right, we'll flash it up on the screen for everyone to read, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Now, best of all, if your mic is working, if your camera is working, and you're in a space where you can talk out loud, click that raised hand icon right in the middle of the strip. That'll tell us you want to join us up here on stage. And if everything works together, we'll press the button and you'll appear right next to us. So you can be here and you can ask a question, have a comment, push back. Think of it as a kind of virtual panel. And we can have up to 4 people here at a time. So those are all ways to communicate. What's happening right now, me talking to you, a slide here, that's not how we usually do things in the forum. Usually it's conversation. And you have all those technologies to make that happen. We're grateful to Shindig for providing them. We're also grateful to another group of people. And these are our supporters on Patreon. If you haven't been to it or checked it out yet, Patreon is a crowdfunding site, kind of like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. The difference here is that people send to Patreon in order to support a creative person rather than a project or a cause. In this case, the creative person is me making stuff like the forum and FTTE and so on about the future of education. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you'll see the way this works out, all the different people who contributed, all the different rewards and so on. Contribute if you can. Sign up for as little as $1 a month. We'd be grateful for your support. And you can see here from this list of great people like Jimmy Kim Han, Paul McConaughey, Kyle Johnson, Bob Johnson, Robert DeRosa. We're very grateful to everyone for their help. Now, on with the show. That's how we got here. That's how the technology works. That's who supports us. That's how we should think about it. Let's dive into today's topic. Today we have a guest who's going to help us think through one of the most contentious topics of our time, the fate of net neutrality after the FCC's repeal in December. Our guest is a friend of mine, Jarret Cummings, who is the Director of Policy and Government Relations at EDUCAUSE. So EDUCAUSE is, of course, the great organization for education and technology. They own the .edu domain. They do tons and tons of professional development. They do they share lots of resources. And Jarret is their point person about policy. And he is their guru about net neutrality and what it means for education. He's joining us here today from Maryland. So Tara, why don't we move the slides over and beam Jarret up on stage. As he comes in, keep in mind, we'd love to hear your questions and your comments. It's going to be easier to do than you think. Jarret, how are you doing?
Hi, Brian. Great. How about yourself?
Just fine. I'm glad to see you, and you even have your EDUCAUSE shirt on.
Absolutely. I wanted to make sure I got the logo wear out. So
You do. That's very, very smart. That's very smart. So I have to ask, you're in Maryland. Are you on the Atlantic coast, or are you inland?
Suburb of DC, so the northwest suburbs in Montgomery County.
Oh, sure. Excellent. Excellent. Good. Well, I hope you're staying warm there.
Yeah, fortunately, I haven't had to go outside today, so it's a nice, balmy 68 degrees here and in my office, and all's well.
Well, we'll do our best for the next 55 minutes to keep you in-house. So that'll help.
Great. I appreciate that. Yeah, we won't make this a walking tour of the neighborhood.
Well, welcome, Jarret, and I really appreciate you taking the time because I know you have a crazy schedule, a lot of other things going on. Well, let's dive in first. Just to get everyone situated, can you tell us what you do as EDUCAUSE's policy director? What are your responsibilities? What do you spend time on?
Well, I really focus primarily on issues like networking and telecommunications. Information security and data privacy, e-learning, which for us also encompasses IT accessibility, and still copyright issues related to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Those, it's one of those things. Every time you think you're out, they pull you back in. So, the Godfather reference there. Those are our core areas. But of course, we try to identify and track, policy issues in general, federal policy issues in general that might impact the role of technology in higher education, either administratively or academically.
So that covers a lot of ground. That must mean you have to travel a great deal as well as do a lot of online work, I would imagine.
Well, fortunately, most of the travel I do is really around town. So it does keep me on the move. We have to worry about different regulatory agencies like our friends at the Federal Communications Commission or the U.S. Department of Education, sometimes the Department of Homeland Security. And of course, there's always the occasional visit to one side of the hill or the other, or sometimes both. Sometimes multiple committees on both sides. So,
well, so your EDUCAUSE is man in DC.
pretty much. We are supported by a team of consultants, and then for specific issues, we reach out and engage topical experts. My job is really to help identify and organize our response to the issues, make sure that we have the right knowledge resources deployed to help address them, and that we build the coalitions necessary with other higher education or interested associations based upon the issue. So, for example, with network neutrality, we have a long history of working with the Association of Research Libraries and the American Library Association around this topic, but also in the current rulemaking, we received great support from the 6 major higher education presidential associations, as well as our colleagues at NACUBO, the Business Officers Association. That's just one set of relationships when it comes to other issues. We work with the other groups that are most interested to try to represent the needs and interests of higher education IT within the broader higher education context.
Oh, excellent. That sounds like an enormous amount of cat herding. Let's take a look at what the cats are being herded around. So in December, as I'm sure everybody here understands, the FCC reversed an earlier decision in favor of net neutrality, rolling back net neutrality guarantees. What's happened in the month or so since? Can you bring us up to speed?
Sure. Well, the most interesting part of the process at this juncture is, even though that new FCC order passed in December, it's still not official, and so that creates a lot of interesting dynamics. The final text of the order was finally released, I believe, last week or the week before, but until it's published in the Federal Register, it's not until 60 days after it's published in the Federal Register that it becomes official. And so right now, you see a lot of swirl as different groups and different stakeholders try to prepare for that eventuality. So, for example, we've seen almost 24 states, as well as a few different public interest groups, already filing suit against the order, primarily in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, where there's a good chance that those suits are premature at this juncture. There's reason to think the court's going to say, well, you're filing a lawsuit against a rule that doesn't yet exist, so thank you very much, but come back when it's official. But the real goal of that action is to make sure that when the cases are heard or consolidated and heard, as may likely happen, that will take place in the DC Circuit. That probably would have happened regardless. The DC Circuit has heard the last 2 legal challenges to network neutrality actions by the FCC. There's every expectation that would happen this time as well. But there were some concerns that telecom groups might try to file legal challenges of their own of some kind, even though they're not trying to overturn the current FCC order, to see if they can get the case heard in a circuit court of appeals that they feel is more amenable to their perspective. So that's one set of, sorry.
No, that'd be a good point. Friends, I have a whole series of questions to ask Jarret about this, but please don't let me hog the hour. I'm sure you all have questions and comments. The idea is first to talk about net neutrality and how it's changing, and then to reach out to what education can do. So as he and I speak, mostly as he speaks, as you have questions, ideas, and comments and suggestions, please use the different technologies at the bottom of the screen in order to share what you'd like to discuss. And please, this can be very, very abstract sounding or very technical sounding. If at any point you're not fully confident about where things are going, please ask us. I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page and no one feels left out. So, Jarret, do you think that First, quick sense. How long until the publication of the Federal Register? Next month or a couple days?
It could be any time. I think the expectation is that we'll get published in early February, and so that would set the timeline for late April, early May for it to go live. It could happen sooner, but basically the order will become official sometime this spring. The good news about the early filings of the lawsuits by the state attorneys general and some other advocacy groups is, we already have a good sense that there's going to be plenty of wagons to which we can hitch our star when the time comes. It's really just going to be a question of assessing, well, first of all, whether the court consolidates all of the legal challenges, which if that happens, then it's very easy to figure out where you file your amicus brief. If they don't consolidate all the cases, then there'll have to be some analysis of where higher education and the library communities feel most comfortable supporting a given challenge. So there'll be some legal maneuvering for us to sort out. But the good news is that we don't have to actually file suit ourselves to be able to support the process, and that's really what we're aiming for.
To not file the suit.
Yeah, what would most likely happen is for higher education and libraries to file amicus briefs, basically statements in support of a given legal challenge. Because obviously filing a suit, particularly at the Circuit Court of Appeals level, is a pretty expensive undertaking, and there's as long as the essence of many of the legal challenges is going to be the same. So we don't necessarily have to file our own suit to be able to find a good platform from which to support a challenge to the FCC's current order.
Okay, so you, both being you, individual Jarret, but also all of your colleagues and teams will be scanning the legal horizon, looking for appropriate suits to join or to file amicus briefs for.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as I said, if the Circuit Court of Appeals consolidates all of the challenges because of their basic similarities, which is highly likely, then that becomes a pretty simple matter. Most of what the legal challenges, and I'll speak to some of the more recent developments at the state level that we've seen just in the last week, trying to use state authority to reinstate network neutrality where possible. Most of the legal challenges really come down to the idea that the FCC violated what's known as the Administrative Procedures Act in pursuing the current activity. That essentially the Administrative Procedures Act governs how federal entities develop their regulations. And one of the provisions of that says that a federal agency can't be quote unquote arbitrary and capricious in terms of changing its rules. And so there's good reason to think that with only 2 years of network neutrality protections firmly on the docket, no strong base of evidence, despite what the FCC majority tried to assert, for thinking that those rules were having any negative impact on broadband investment or the delivery of broadband services, et cetera. There's good reason to think that what the FCC's done here is arbitrary and capricious, and we'll just have to see if a court views it the same way.
Well, that sounds like a pretty classic legal challenge. Good. I'm glad to have this. And if anybody, by the way, if anyone participating in this video conference is involved in either in this particular legal challenge or in the law in general, please don't hesitate to share your expertise. Well, let me add to that another angle, which is I hate to begin any sentence with "could Congress help," but is it possible that the Congressional Review Act may actually pass? I mean, is it possible that the votes will assemble for that, at least in the Senate?
It's the Senate action is really a statement bill at the end of the day, because they have now enough votes votes secured to actually get a vote on the Congressional Review Act action in the Senate. The question is, when will that get scheduled? Does it have enough votes to actually pass the Senate? But even if it passed the Senate, there's very little likelihood that's going to be taken up in the House. The companion effort that's currently underway in the House has acquired a number of co-sponsors. Unfortunately, they're all Democratic, which means there's no chance that that's going anywhere in the Republican House. But by some miracle, if they manage to get the bill through the Senate, get through the House, President Trump would certainly veto it, and there would not be the votes available to override. So this is really more about Senate Democrats and House Democrats positioning themselves in relation to network neutrality as a political issue heading into the 2018 midterm elections.
Do you think that's likely to be an issue that people will talk about in November?
In some jurisdictions, it very much depends on where you are. It's hard to anticipate how, as consumers and voters become more aware of the amount of control that the FCC has just handed to their internet service providers over what they will be able to see and do online in the long run. Particularly in California, where they're a fairly savvy electorate in many cases, and there are a number of Republican House seats that are already in purple districts. It could have an impact in an environment like that.
You can imagine that in, say, the San Francisco area, for example, or in New York City or Boston, tech-centric centers. Well, let me ask one more question about this before we turn this over to education, which is, have you noticed internet service providers doing anything yet with this new opening? Have there been any announcements of tiered pricing, any reports of outrages or misbehavior, or is it still too soon for that?
There have been a couple of minor blips, I would say, but nothing that really indicates significant problems as yet. I mean, in part, the current rules, the 2015 rules, are still on the books until that 2017 order becomes official. So there's a difference between knowing that those rules are still active, even if it's only temporarily, just that the FCC is not going to enforce them, and them not being on the books at all. And then you have seen, for example, Comcast modified its public statement about network neutrality. It's what it was committed to in relation to network neutrality, to give it more wiggle room. There's been concern, another small ISP, I can't remember exactly in which state, started to assert to its consumers that it could identify their use of peer-to-peer file sharing applications, and that it might take action against their use of those file sharing applications. But those are pretty much ad hoc at this point.
Okay. It's still early days, which is great, because this gives us, in case this doesn't happen, in case this falls apart because of legal challenges and so on, then great. But if this does go through and the landscape changes, we here on the forum, thanks to you, Jarret, get an early crack at what's going on. Again, friends, you must have a whole bunch of questions, and indeed there is one. We've got a two-parter from, I think, Greg Schuckman. Tara, why don't you put this up on the screen, please? I'll have to mangle your name, Greg. For those of us who provide distance education, there's an expectation that we're going to be charged more to deliver our content. There's a second part. Is there a cost estimate for what net neutrality is going to cost higher education as a whole? Great question, Greg.
Yeah, I'll take the second part first. At this point, there literally is no way to know. We are in completely uncharted waters. And in fact, that's part of what gives the lie, in my perspective, to the way Chairman Pai has tried to present the order. Because he's tried to say, well, this is just returning us to the light touch regulation that existed previously. Well, he is returning broadband internet services to the legal classification that existed previously. but never before has the FCC attempted to completely abrogate any responsibility for network neutrality whatsoever. In fact, the tension has always been, how can the FCC do something about network neutrality under that old legal classification? So because the FCC has pushed this so far off in a new direction where there is no real network neutrality protection to speak of coming from the FCC as a result of this order, we're now in an environment we've never been before, where ISPs truly do have relatively unfettered freedom to do what they want with their networks and with what transits over their networks. So there just isn't a basis yet for doing that type of cost estimate. That said, it is certainly a concern of EDUCAUSE, the presidential associations and the library associations that work with us, that as internet service providers look to leverage the control that the new order gives them to increase their profits, that if we want to make sure our institutions can deliver their content and services, particularly their multimedia content and services, the way they were intended to be developed, that we could find ourselves having to pay for prioritization, having to pay to make sure that our content and services is delivered at the speed and quality that we need it to be.
This is really good. That's a great answer. And I appreciate the difficulty in pinning down a number or an estimate, because this is still early and there's such possibility. In many ways, we're in uncharted territory, although we're charting it right now. Greg, that's a fantastic question. My heart goes out to you as someone whose entire educational enterprise is entirely based on the internet. We have a couple more questions that have just come in. We have one from Nancy, Nancy Marksbury. And Nancy asks, this might be a gossipy kind of question, but I wonder if you have any insight into the dynamics that exist among the FCC commissioners. From the videos, they seem to diverge widely. And of course, was it 2 of them are appointed by Democratic Party affiliates, 3 are Republicans, I think?
Yeah, whenever the... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's a good question, Nancy. Please go ahead, Jared.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the FCC, the composition of the FCC always shifts with the party in control of the White House. So there's always a 3-2 majority in favor of either the Republicans or the Democrats. And yes, on this issue in particular, the Democrat commissioners and the Republican commissioners diverge very widely. Chairman Pai, during the previous rulemaking, when it was a 3-2 Democratic majority, both he and his then fellow Republican commissioner, Commissioner Riley, were very outspoken about their opposition to what Chairman Wheeler was trying to accomplish with the 2015 rules in terms of reclassifying internet service as a telecommunications service so that the full weight and authority of the FCC could be brought to bear. Chairman Pai has tried to make himself a bit of a celebrity, quite honestly, on this issue. If you are so inclined, you can Google up the videos that he has made where he tries to poke fun at network neutrality proponents. They're pretty bad. Well, I give him kudos for at least trying to be funny. So when you see the commissioners, part of their public statements is clearly, some political posturing, no doubt. I mean, there may be some elements of their opposition that's exaggerated, for lack of a better way of putting it, so that they really get across their perspective on the issue. But I think at root, there's very little doubt that Commissioners Clyburn and Rosenworcel truly believe that the 2015 network neutrality protections are necessary, and there's very little doubt that Chairman Pai and his Republican colleagues are deeply opposed to the very concept of the FCC implementing network neutrality protections.
Well, that's a great question, Nancy, and that's a really solid answer, Jarret. And let me, if I can shift our ground a little bit. Now that you've nicely explored where net neutrality is going and the legal and structural procedures and policies around it. Let's focus a bit more on education. And let me just ask everybody to think about where this is going to impact them. Greg gave us a great opening shot with the question of, will it simply cost more to deliver and to consume? And just think about how this could impact all your different ways that you make and consume education, the way that you work. And to help us do that, we have a question here from John. I'm not sure of his last name. Let's bring him up on stage. Let's see. This is John. I think John's in New York. Drum roll. We have the.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Jarret. I am in New York. So I don't want to ask about Ajit Pai's goofy, oversized Reese's coffee mug, but what I do want to ask is, how do you see the new rules in net neutrality affecting implicit costs? Not just on the bottom line, but do you think that we say that new net neutrality rules would harm innovation, but how would they harm innovation for educators, for institutions? Would it push them into the arms of large private actors that may not have their best interests at heart?
Good question.
So go ahead. Well, I think the best metaphor for this discussion is, thinking about the cableization of the internet, and thinking about what happens if you are in a public interest or a public service function like higher education. Do we need to worry about finding ourselves essentially relegated to the public access channel on an ISP's network, so that they can make sure that ESPN and Netflix and the forthcoming Disney Channel, writ large, not just the Disney Channel that my kids watch, but the mega company that their content company they're putting together, that those streams of content can go through with crystal clear, ultra high def, 7.1 surround sound. Meanwhile, is our content going to be able to reach our end users with that same level of quality, or just the level of quality and speed that we need it to in order to function? And I think that's particularly concerning as we think ahead to, not just the current movement on cloud services, but also adaptive learning. The continuing development of simulations and the rich simulations in order to facilitate teaching and learning. There are just a lot of, competency-based education when it's tied to both of those types of innovative environments. There's just a great reason to believe that higher education content and services are going to use more and more bandwidth to help students learn in these increasingly rich ways. And if we can't be sure that that they're going to be able to access that content in those environments the way we've designed them, then we don't know if they're going to work. You can think of it like another metaphor might be, or analogy, might be, what if your Call of Duty immersive environment via your PlayStation is throttled back because Comcast has a deal with Microsoft to facilitate the delivery of Xbox games. Well, not only is that likely to negatively impact, Sony, but it could negatively impact us too, as we're trying to deliver learning opportunities that use equally rich multimedia.
I think that's especially likely as we add more virtual reality, which is an incredible memory and bandwidth hog right now. Those are really, really large files. And so as we move to more content, that's going to be a big issue. Jonathan, that's a good question. Thank you. Did you, friends, while we have Jonathan up here, and while we have Jarret up here, you can see how easy it is to come up on stage. So if you have a camera and mic that are working, just press the raised hand at the bottom of the screen and we can pop you up on stage. And again, think about the educational dimensions. Let me ask you one very narrow question, Jarret. I know it's early, but should campuses start looking ahead into either supporting or encouraging the use of ISP monitoring tools? For example, I think I shared with you a couple of these, like Wiki and Uniprobe, that will actually, from your computer, take a look at your bit stream and see what kind of signal you're getting and how this could possibly unfold. And would this be a research project for campus IT departments, or perhaps for computer scientists, or perhaps for some association to pursue?
Well, I think, and I will give a plug to your friends at NiserNet, your friends, my friends at NiserNet, as well as the research and education networking community writ large, our friends at the Quilt and Internet 2, who do a fantastic job of providing, most colleges and universities with great access, great bandwidth for the internet that circumvents some of the concerns that they would face if they had to buy their network access, their internet gateways from Verizon or AT&T or Comcast. So from an institutional IT perspective, I don't know how those network assessment tools would come into play. The question might be, how can the academic and IT sides of the house work together to identify information and tools that would be useful for students and also for faculty who are trying to access institutional resources from over their home and mobile connections, to empower them to be able to assess when they're running into problems, and then helping the institution build a body of information that it can then share with its elected officials and professional associations. Thank you. So that we can reflect back to Congress that if this current open internet order, quote unquote open internet order, is maintained, here are the harms that our students and institutions are experiencing.
Wow, that would be quite a move to do, and a very evidence-based, indeed a rigorous effort. I wonder if this would even reach as far as teaching information or digital literacy, where one skill might be to try to assess your ISP's conditions of use and actual provision of services.
Yeah, that's, the clear ideological belief on the part of the FCC majority is that the consumer should be in control, should make these decisions. Now, of course, I would assert that the consumer broadband space does not provide the competitive foundation on which a consumer could reasonably make choices, make decisions. I live in one of the probably best served areas in the entire country, and
Sure.
I have a choice between Verizon and Comcast. And
you have two.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm lucky, and they like to talk, about, well, how 5G mobile broadband's coming, and then maybe that'll be, a new competitive option. But again, two of those providers of wireline service are also mobile providers. So it's not like you've, expanded your options greatly. And then the question of whether T-Mobile or Sprint would provide 5G service that would really be competitive for current home wired internet. I think that's a fairly open question. So the FCC's current position is based on an assumption of competition that the FCC's own data shows does not exist unless you cherry pick and interpret in very specific ways. And so, their idea that the market is going to bring balance and that the market is going to limit what we might consider abusive behavior by ISPs in relation to network neutrality, it's just not supported by the actual competition that exists in the marketplace.
It really feels like a case of market failure in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of questions that have come in, and again, friends, please don't be shy. There's a lot to be asked, a lot to be explored around here. Tom Dolan has a legal question, which I don't fully grasp, so maybe you can grab this, which is, should net neutrality be under Title II or some other title?
Yeah, what Tom is referring to is Title II of the Communications Act, which is the law that fundamentally created the FCC and gave it its basic authorities. And so the key to the 2015 rules was when Chairman Wheeler and the Democratic majority at that time voted to reclassify what are known as mass market broadband internet access services, or what we would just consider consumer broadband, as a telecommunications service. So the Title II of the Communications Act gives the FCC tremendous authority to regulate telecommunication services, because the original telecommunications service that it was dealing with was the Bell monopoly. So, you know, the FCC, and ultimately why the FCC in 2015 chose to reclassify was because that gives the FCC fairly unequivocal legal authority for the rules that it implemented. The problem to that point had been that Title I of the Communications Act, which governs information services, gives the FCC much less authority to regulate those services. And so the prior order that was overturned that led to the 2015 rules was essentially the FCC's attempt, starting first under Chairman Powell, a Republican FCC chairman during the Bush administration, to have his cake and eat it too. They wanted Title I classification of broadband so that the FCC couldn't impose utility-style regulations, but they recognized that the FCC still needed to provide some protections for network neutrality, given what we now understand as the level of unfettered control internet service providers have over your home and mobile connection, my home and mobile connection without it. So our position, and circling back to Tom's key question, our position was, yes, broadband internet access services should be considered telecommunication services under Title II of the Communications Act, and the 2015 rules based upon that classification should have remained in place. However, we also argued that if the FCC was going to do what it ultimately did and reclassify those services as Title I information services, that it still had plenty of legal authority from other statutes to implement network neutrality protections that would be strong and enforceable. It's just that this commission chose to reclassify and then say, oh no, we can't do any of that. So all we're going to require after we reclassify is that whatever the ISP does, they have to publish publicly. So it's reclassification and then relying on quote unquote transparency and marketplace competition to prevent internet service providers from violating network neutrality.
Well, thank you for a very, very clear and accessible answer. Thank you, Jonathan, for adding to it in the chat box. Thank you, Tom, for asking a very, very powerful foundational question. We have a couple more that have come up, and one is from Paul, who asks a question which takes us a little way from education, but actually does impact us. Could you speak to the recent news about bots flooding the FCC comments section, impersonating Americans that were supposedly against net neutrality? So this was this past summer when the FCC put out a request asking Americans what do you think about possibly repealing net neutrality, and it was 99% against, but there was a large number that were spam bots in some form that were actually using real people's identity. And New York's Attorney General Schlesinger is actually trying to sue and figure out what happened, since it's a case of identity theft. And so far, the FCC has said nothing. That's my very, very quick summary. Jarret, please, you know much more about this.
Well, no, that was actually a very good summary. I mean, that's the reality is that as the comment record has been examined, the number of actual unique comments is definitely a significant minority of the overall volume of comments that were received. And there's quite a bit of evidence that comments were being filed on the behalf of people who never intended to file anything, didn't even know that there was, a comment record or an internet, open internet order process underway. So, it's understandable that the FCC would not want to delve into this issue because they're not really interested in exploring the basis for the rules themselves to begin with. The order that they ultimately issued is pretty much the order that you could have predicted from their original notice of proposed rulemaking, with some minor tweaks around the edges. So the die on this was cast from the start. I think we had a brief moment of hope that the high volume of pro network neutrality comments that did get submitted, and now you could argue whether some of those were spam bots too or not, but there was certainly a very high volume of pro network neutrality comments submitted. We were hopeful that was giving the Republican commissioners sufficient pause that they would consider something like the proposals we were putting forward. And so it took them longer to get the final order out than we expected. And we were hopeful that meant they were reconsidering their original path. But at the end of the day, they decided to damn the torpedoes and go full speed ahead.
Very, very fast. Thank you, Paul, for mentioning this. This is a bizarre case. And one of the connections to education is this question of fake identity theft, and the growing suspicion about veracity of content online. In the opposite of dissatisfaction with veracity, we have Mary Wayman, who has a question. So you bring Mary on stage. And Mary, if I mispronounced your last name, please forgive me, or I shouldn't have to say it instead. And while we're bringing Mary up, let's make sure that we have about 12 minutes for more questions from you. So think about what you'd like to say or ask. Hello, Mary.
Hi. Okay, I do want to tell you, yes, you did mispronounce my name. It's Wehrman. It's not that hard. It just is spelled weird. It's a German name. Sorry, it's just. What I want to know is my experience with people around me in this institution is it seems like they're completely unaware of the potential change that's coming because of the decision that the FCC made. And I noticed a couple of months ago we were having a discussion about something and how we were going to be doing something, and I think really it was a situation of our learning management system was really bogging down. And I had made a comment, something about, well, I hope this isn't something that we're going to be contending with on a very regular basis in the future because of that decision. And someone else said to me, what do you mean? And this was clear back in November. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if the FCC gets their way, we're going to have some tremendous changes. And I'm really concerned about what's going to happen because I think that our learners, our instruction delivery is going to be so bogged down, and we depend on it so much. I just don't. I'm really concerned. I mean, are we just going to come to a standstill, or what's going to happen? And they were completely shocked, and they said, I really don't understand what you're talking about. And so I, kind of gave them some information, and I said, here, this is where you can vote. Get your opinion known that this is not a good thing. And so, trying to get that word out to other people, but I was really stunned by how people were seeing it more of how this is going to affect me at home, maybe, but not really at work, because we're so, I think we're buffered by, we have high speed at the university, and, so it's really convenient. And I think people don't realize that we're not going to be insulated from that. And I'm just kind of stunned by that. And I'm wondering, is anybody else, experiencing that and seeing that kind of stuff? Or is this just a weird little Midwest, weirdness? I don't know.
No, I think that's
Jarret,
pretty normal, actually. Yeah, it's most people are to their great benefit and mental health, do not spend as much time as I do tracking everything that happens. I mean, in the swamp, so to speak. So, you know, I don't have the kind of coverage that a lot of people do, but I've got a pretty good idea where most of the lily pads are. And, you know, you're better off if, in many cases, if you don't. But I think that's fairly normal until it starts to have a direct negative impact on, you know, people's lives in some sense. It's hard. It's a kind of amorphous concept to wrap your mind around, especially if it's not an issue that you follow on a day-to-day, or in my case, a year-to-year basis. I mean, I've been following this issue in some form or fashion for going on 4 years. And so if you don't, it's hard to see how all the dots connect until they hit you. But that's why I think what's, you know, the recent development of states such as Montana, the governor of Montana, the governor of New York, you know, issuing executive orders, trying to leverage the purchasing power of the states to drive network neutrality in their jurisdictions. I think that's going to be very interesting in terms of helping to bring this conversation down from a national level to a state level, which could be very helpful, not just in terms of whether they're successful or not, but also, you know, the only way it's going to take legal challenges to overturn, either legal challenges or legislative action in those states to overturn those executive orders, because they deal with state procurement. So it's not like the state, you know, the issue of federal preemption comes into play fairly strongly. The current order was written in a very clever way to say, we're not going to do anything other than impose transparency requirements. But because this is an interstate commerce issue, you know, we're not going to allow the states to pass laws to, you know, implement network neutrality either. Now, there's a question about whether that works, and we'll see how that plays out. But by going through the state procurement route, you take that issue out of play, because they're not trying to directly govern internet service provision. They're just saying, this is what the state is going to do from a procurement standpoint. So that's going to force it's going to force the FCC or the ISPs to go state by state to argue the case as to why the state should not be allowed to do this. And the more those conversations are had on a state-by-state basis, the more it's going to impact citizens closer to where they live. And so I think that that's, in addition to the possibility that that may actually work while the federal courts sort out the current order, or Congress eventually does something, it's also going to help to bring those conversations down into the states, to local newspapers, local media outlets, and make it more real for actual consumers.
So is there something that we can be doing to force this with our states then? Is there some way to formulate the questions that can bring that to our states?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, if especially now that New York's on board. I mean, it's one thing for the governor of Montana, no offense to anybody from Montana, but it's one thing for the governor of Montana to say the, you know, purchasing power of the state of Montana is going to be used to try to push network neutrality in this state. It's quite another for the governor of New York to do it. We'll see if the governor of California picks that up as well, Washington, Oregon, you know, the entire West Coast. So I think the first answer to your question is, there's an emerging model for how states that want to try to do something in this issue can do so and do it in a fashion that may withstand a federal preemption charge. Now, we don't know that yet, but I think asking your legislators, the governor, I mean, in this case, so far, the governors are doing it through executive action. But of course, state legislatures can impact state procurement policy through legal action as well. And that is, of course, more, you know, just like we're finding out at the federal level, where a president's executive order is only as good as the president who's there to sustain it. You know, you could say the same thing about a governor's executive order. So In the near term, there's asking governors, hey, if they can do this in Montana and New York, why can't we do it here? But there's also the point to discuss with your elected officials, hey, the legislature has all the power it needs to pass laws governing state procurement policy. Why don't we enshrine this in state law?
Mary, what a fantastic question. And Jarret, what a terrific answer. Thank you.
Okay.
And Mary, I appreciate the photo behind you. That gives us some inspiration up here in the north. Friends, I'm conscious of time. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions just came in. Let's bring up what we can. Let's see what we can fit in. I think we have Roxanne Riskin's question. Let's see. Right now, many universities throttle their bandwidth on student networks due to so many gaming devices. Do you see IT departments creating new policy for using student-side internet bandwidth sooner or later? Wow, subtle question, Roxanne. Good one.
Well, they're just it's a different issue when you're talking about the campus network versus someone's home or mobile connection. So I can see institutions continuing to look at network management practices on their campus networks to make sure that those networks are available for the research and education purposes for which the institution invested,
Right.
and for which those networks are intended. How institutional policy can reach beyond the campus network to support students in terms of their home and mobile connections, I'm not sure I can see how that comes together.
This is some crazy stuff. Thank you, Roxanne. That's quite a probing question. Let's keep an eye on this. We also have a question from Taylor Kendall out in the Rocky Mountains. Taylor wants to know, would be interested to flip the coin and hear thoughts of any of the positive effects that could come for education in a post-net neutral democracy, aka the pre-internet, them good old days to some. Well, if I remember rightly, one of the reasons that some of the ISPs gave in favor of ending net neutrality was that they would make more money, which doesn't mean to make more money by itself, but that they would be able to spend that money on expanding internet access, either by serving underserved populations, so giving Jarret maybe 3 different brands to choose from, or growing out 5G networks. That's the argument. Jarret, is there any other positive possibility that we've missed?
Well, that's certainly the ideological argument that's been made, that by removing supposed barriers to broadband deployment, and in this case, the FCC is not just talking about network neutrality rules, which they characterized as barriers to broadband deployment, but they've also had an ongoing rulemaking process about forcing localities in particular to amend their provisions governing rights of way, access to light poles and conduits and so forth, to make it easier for ISPs to deploy broadband. But my sense is that, well, there's very little evidence to support that position. I think there's quite a bit more evidence to suggest that where there's demand, supply will follow. And so pushing supply where there is no, where it's expensive to deliver and there's not enough demand to support those investments, you would have to assert that the impacts of supposed barriers like network neutrality or these rights of way issues are so great that there's such a source of cost that if you remove them, the costs of deployment would go down so much that it would then be cost effective to deploy broadband in these underserved areas. And there's just no economic modeling I've seen that supports that.
Me too. Well, I tried. Good question, Taylor. We'll have to keep thinking of this. But we also have to keep answering just a few more questions. We have one from Rick Crane. Let's see what Rick has. Rick wants to know, do you foresee higher education institutions themselves taking advantage of the lack of network neutrality to make deals for higher speed access to their students? For example, Netflix going to dorms. Interesting question, Rick. Canny question.
Well, I think it first depends upon whether you're at an institution that has outsourced its residential hall networking. So I know some institutions, their answer to network provision in the dorms that's not going to impact the core campus network is to say, we're going to use a local ISP to provision the dorms, and we're going to keep the campus network for academic buildings and administrative facilities and research facilities. In that context, your residence hall contract would be like any, depending on the size of your institution, small, medium to large local business customer for internet access. And the question would really come down to what kind of package is the local ISP trying to offer you to encourage you to adopt their service. So there's been, in the mobile space, we're used to seeing zero rating, where the offer is that you can use a particular service without it impacting your data cap. So it would very much depend upon the nature of the network your residence halls have with a provider in terms of how that service is being priced, what the basis for that cost is, and therefore how they might try to package some incentives based upon their ability to direct your attention to, like if you're Comcast, maybe they want you to use, NBC and Universal media properties as opposed to some others. And if you use those in your residence halls, or if you give those some sort of priority into your residence halls, maybe that gets you a lower price from the provider. But if your campus is provisioning its residence halls on the campus network, and it's part of a research and education network like NYSERNet or ORNet or many of the others, it really wouldn't make a difference, I don't believe.
That was a rich answer for a really, really deep question that really digs into, from another angle, where education could go. But friends, where we have to go is out. We are out of time. We've just shot past the end of the hour. And first of all, Jarret, Libby, thank you. You have been so patient and you've been so informative. You've given us such great answers to really, really challenging questions at a very difficult time. I just want to express, on behalf of everybody, our gratitude for all your contributions today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity.
Listen, can we just down the road, maybe this spring or summer, depending on how things unfold, can we come back with you as a follow-up once this hits the Federal Register? Well, and again, on behalf of everybody, thank you, and we really appreciate your work. This is good
Great.
fight. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Friends, we'll come back to you. Thanks again. And friends, we have to wrap up and talk about where we're going for the next week. But let me just thank all of you. I know this is a challenging subject, and I admire the wide variety of questions you asked, everything from practical policy to law to how this can impact you. All right, for Net Neutrality was this week. Next week, we're going to dive into the subject of innovation with Roland Moe. This is a brilliant, brilliant fellow from the West Coast, a dear friend and someone who has a really unusual perspective. His job is to pursue innovation, and he is one of innovation's fiercest critics. So next week, we're going to dive deeply into innovation, friend or foe. Look forward to that. Now, also, between now and next week, our book club has begun. So we have our new reading, and this is a delightful reading. If you haven't had a chance to, it's called Soonish by Kelly and Zach Wiener-Smith. One of the authors is a famous cartoonist who makes a webcomic called Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, which is one of the nerdiest and most funny, long-running comics, mostly humor about philosophy, ethics, and especially science. The book is a dive into 10 technologies, which, as Zach and Kelly say, will either improve and or ruin everything. And these technologies are explained with humor, insight. It's extremely accessible and fun. Please dive in with us. You'll really enjoy it. Now, also, if that's not enough for you to think about, innovation and 10 new technologies for next time, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, go to ftte.us or go to shindig.com and learn more about this technology. In the meantime, thank you so much. Have a great week. Stay warm if you're in the North Country, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.